We are now going into part two. This morning laid out some, by no means all, thank you very much, some, by no means all, of the issues, fundamental issues about supply. We're now beginning to go into the beginnings of even more tricky issues. We've got food law enforcement. We've got ex-cabinet office, inside senior civil servants. We've got science policy, insights onto food safety. We've got the social policy implications, which was raised earlier about health. And we've got environmental policy. These talks are now going to lay the ground for then moving in the last session into civil society. So with no more ado, I invite Jenny Morris, who's the head of TIFSIT, but also has been a luminary in the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health for Food Law Enforcement Officers. Jenny.
Thank you for inviting me here. I found this morning really interesting. I'm learning a lot. The good thing for me is listening to people. We've all got similar themes and similar concerns. It's always worrying if you're a speaker and you're going to say something totally different. Maybe that's fun for some. I'd prefer to be in a similar area to other people. What I've just put up here is, in this brief 10 minutes that I have, the kind of things that I want to explore. So they're building on what's been said this morning. The first bit I want to look at is what's the importance of legislation. Now, we've talked a bit about legislation this morning, but where I want to get to, I think Tim announced me earlier as a regulator, an enforcement officer. I don't actually do that now, but I have been, and I work with a lot of enforcement officers, and I work with the Food Standards Agency and at European level on food control. And when I say food control, forgive me, it's my shorthand, it's my jargon for meaning the things that we do to keep food safe. And this is a food safety-based bit. Clearly, there are other things that we're concerned about healthy food, sustainable food. But I am going to focus what I'm going to talk about on food safety because it's easier and because it's what I'm going to do. So I want to talk a bit about the legislation, what that makes us do now, how it changes, and one of the earlier speakers referred to the complexities of Europe in creating legislation. I want to tell you a short story about a piece of lobbying I'm involved in at the moment on change to European legislation, the pros and cons that there might be if you are in Europe or not, and then talk about what the future might look like. And I think no one knows, that's been made very clear, but we can look at some of the boundaries and some of the concerns. And I want to finish it by really noting that actually, Brexit is of particular interest here, but we are in a hugely changing environment with or without it. And it was referred to earlier around austerity and the impacts on austerity, and those are changing things very fast now. And things are changing so fast, it's really difficult to keep up, let alone thinking about what Brexit would do. So with that introduction, and see I've only got 10 minutes, let me move on. Oh, 8 minutes. Thank you, Tim. Tell me off. So, the food safety legislation that we work to in this country is European. And in practice, the legislation is the same across the whole of Europe. There are some variations, there are some national variations, but they're quite small. You might argue, and many people do, well, you do things differently in this country. If you go to France, you've got all these markets and all this food, and they don't mess around, and there are no controls on it. It's the UK. No, it's not. It's just that the UK has this process that when it agrees to things, it usually does them. I couldn't possibly comment on whether other member states go to the same extent. All I will say is that our legislation is based on law. And the comment was made earlier about gold plating. Now, because I come from a regulated background, I probably would say that nowadays I don't think you see much, certainly in terms of the food safety legislation. And one of the reasons is this European legislation sets the standard. There's actually no translation except for language, and you can get some variations in language. It's not interpretation, the standard is set. That's the basis. So it is effectively the same in every member state. And the legislation is what the regulator looks for. The legislation, in the main part, sets the standards for business. It tells business if it's going to prepare food, what the rooms are going to be like, the temperature control, how you train people, how you manage food safely. It sets the standard. The legislation says the food business is responsible, but it also says the regulator, in this country, that's the Food Standards Agency for Food Safety at the national level, and the local authorities, environmental health and trading standards at the local levels. They have to carry some checks out on business, but it is business responsibility. This list is just to show you the regulations. The general one says food must be safe, a good starting place. It talks about what happens when things go wrong, how a business must withdraw and take things off the market, and how it traces food. The hygiene of foodstuffs sets the standards for the business preparing the food, and most importantly, a food safety management system to make sure it stays safe. Then we have food of animal origin. In terms of risk, and risk was mentioned earlier, food of animal origin, in other words, meat, fish, dairy, is seen as higher risk, and there are some additional controls on it. The bit I'm going to tell you about in a minute is the official controls one, which is what the regulator needs to do and how that's changing. And the bottom one's just a bit of techie stuff, coming back to this risk thing, which says to business, if you are going to produce certain types of food, for instance, baby food, which is clearly a real risk issue, the regulator, Europe, will set standards as to how much of any bugs you can have in it. It's very worried, particularly about salmonella, because if you feed a baby salmonella, I think you would expect that things are going to go pretty badly wrong. So it's risk-based, it sets the responsibility for business, but it requires the regulator to make checks. So the European legislation sets the standards to which business operates and which the regulator works across. Now, what I didn't talk about in that, because I was just rushing through, is, well, the fact is there are different standards for different things. There are specifics for imports, exports, and domestic controls. Once food is within the European Union, it moves freely. So in this country, if we import any food from other member states, we can't make checks on it, because the expectation is we've all got the same standards, so we all operate to the same standard. It moves freely. If food comes into the European Union from a country outside it, it is termed generally, and I'm generalizing here, so if there's anyone who's got specialist information, please don't pick me up on this, as a third country. If you are a third country, and this is important if we come out, you are required to meet all European legislation standards. You don't have a voice in it, and that has been said by several people earlier. In addition, if you are importing food, say, from China, the European Union has its own audit team called the Food and Veterinary Office. They have to approve a factory in this third country to say it meets a standard before it's even allowed to consider sending food to Europe. It then has to send veterinary certification, and when it's imported, the importer has to pay a fee. And there are inspections at the borders, and what those inspections are depends on risk. Sometimes it's physical inspections, sometimes it's documentary checks. But all of this is laid down by the EU, and if you want to trade with the EU from outside, you must meet the standards. The legislation that controls what the regulators do is the official controls regulation. This is one of those that I listed. This is currently under review. It's because Europe is trying to simplify some of its legislation. It's bringing together a whole load of regulations for the regulators simplifying, updating, and it also wants to try and sort out funding, because a lot of countries are struggling to properly fund their systems. Now, at the moment, there are two outstanding problems on this legislation. It's been being reviewed for some time, several years. It always takes a long time at European level. One of it is charging. Charging, there is a deal. The second bit is who inspects food. It's really important if you've got a food inspector, they know what they're doing. Most of Europe uses veterinarians, official veterinarians. This country uses environmental health practitioners. Our vets in this country generally aren't trained in food. They do large animals, furry animals. In Europe, they're trained in food. Eastern European states think, therefore, the only people, sorry for saying that, who should be able to do this is a vet. The UK is arguing against this because we have environmental health practitioners who do this. They've been doing it for years. We've had no problems from external inspections from Europe. It works. If we take our environmental health officers away from ports and from internal processing plants, there are about 3,000 of them, we would have to replace them with vets who in this country are not trained, so we would have public health risks there. And it would cost more. But because we're in the European Union, we can work together. We've got the Commission saying flexibility is important. We've got the Commissioner saying flexibility is important. A number of other member states are saying flexibility is important. My organisation, our members have been writing to all our MEPs to say when this goes to Parliament, because it's the European Parliament who wants to change, vote for flexibility. We're in a good place now, but it has to go back to the European Parliament. We don't know where it will go. But we've been able to exert pressure on it. Now, you might say, of course, well, if you're outside the EU, isn't a problem. You could do whatever you like in your own country. Up until a point, you can. But remember, if you want to export as a third country, or even on a trade agreement, as Norway and Switzerland do, into the EU, you've got to meet all their standards, and you have no choice on influencing what those standards will be. So that's export. But then we have a load of food imported from Europe currently. What are we going to do about that? At the moment, we all operate to the same systems and standards. We don't check. If we come out of Europe, are we going to put import controls on all the trade that's coming in? What does that mean in terms of costs? What happens if the European legislation changes? What are we going to do? We will have no food legislation, effectively, because all our legislation is European. It's direct effect. We used to have the Food Safety Act, which effectively gave us all the legislation. As the European legislation's come in, most of that's been repealed. We would have to look at new legislation. And how long would it take to do that? Would we use the same standards as the European legislation, to which all the inspectors have been trained, all the businesses comply? I would think we wouldn't want to change it radically, but we would have to think how we make it work, because the European legislation is what we use now. We have an implementing act to bring it into force in the UK. But what happens if we're no longer part of Europe? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but certainly it would be confusion. We would, of course, be able to decide, do we want the same standards or not? Do we want higher, lower? Again, a choice. One of the things that my organisation is battling with at the moment is our inspectors go to university, 3 years. They have to do about a year practical training. As a local authority inspector, they're highly trained and they're quite expensive. Fine, thank you. They are being reduced. They are being cut. They are finding it harder to do the work. If you had a lower educated inspector, it would cost less. But what about public protection? What would that mean? Of course, at the moment, what that inspector is, what they must do, is defined in the European legislation, and we can't get out of it. And from my point of view, and the inspector's point of view, and probably the public and consumer's point of view, that's a good thing, because it enshrines that standard of competence. And this is what inspectors do. All of this is based on European legislation and standards. That's what they're trained to do. How will this change? And the bottom one there, I've put the food hygiene rating scheme. I hope some of you know what this is. If you look in restaurants, you will see in their windows a 0 to 5 rating. That tells you what the inspector saw. That, again, is based on the European legislation. It's the Food Standards Agency's flagship. It is seen as innovation, giving consumer power to tell them what's going on so they can vote with their feet. What are we going to do about that? Because we spent lots and lots of money on it. How are we going to sustain it and protect people? It's not just nerdy, it actually makes a difference, because all the evaluation shows it's driving up hygiene standards, which must be good for us all. So future, I'm getting to the end, hopefully about on time. Whether or not we leave, things are going to change. Austerity has reduced the number of inspectors. They will not be able to do what they have done in the past. We've got new risks and challenges. Food fraud was mentioned. Food fraud has come up the agenda hugely since horse meat, but you've got the same inspectors and little more money to do it, so where are we going to focus? I would suggest that you're going to see less public sector intervention, and I know Tim's got particular views about that one. I think it's going to be more intelligence-led and reactive, and that to me, as someone who's interested in public protection, is of concern. I want to prevent rather than react when it goes wrong. Greater risk-based focus. As an eminent professor in risk said, the more you do risk-focused interventions, the more risk there is of failure, because you put your intervention level up higher. More business responsibility, more reward. What I would suggest is business is responsible, but business, if it can show it's doing well, they won't see inspectors very often, so there will be a reward part there, which sounds good, but the inspectorate will still need to make some checks. So, more consumer empowerment, good. How will that work? Not sure. And this last bit here about conflict between local and national, if you look away about how power is in terms of controlling what goes on between national and local, it's being devolved down. It's going to regions, you will have mayors and cities, you've got more localization. But actually, what happens to food then? Because food is a really national issue. If you deal with it differently, depending on your locality, what's that going to be for business or consumers? We've got a whole load of things going on there. That might give you a postcode lottery, and that's on top of Brexit. Thank you very much.